Can you believe that this behemoth of a console's been on the market for 2 years now? I know I have a hard time believing it, considering Sony only releases like 5 into the wild at a time. But it's true.
Last year, I released a video talking about the PlayStation 5, and my personal experience having been someone who was fortunate enough to have bought the system on day one. I talked about the console's features, the controller, the games that I played on it, and more, and in the end, I felt like I had made a relatively alright video. But the wicked wheel of time keeps on spinning, and thus another year has passed, and since my penance as a self-proclaimed YouTuber is to celebrate anniversaries,
I'm free.
here we are.
I wanted to do another video this year to commemorate the PlayStation 5 being available for purchase for 2 years now. But instead of just talking about the games I played between that original video and this one, making jokes about how it's not available to buy anywhere and all of that jazz, I decided instead to do a ranking video. But I also wanted to start a few fights. So this time around, instead of ranking each game on a tier list, I'll be talking about them from worst to best. God have mercy on my soul. So to keep things simple, I'm going to be talking about games that I only own a physical copy for on the PlayStation 5. So while I may own and play games like Astro's Playroom, Bugsnax, or Stray, they're not really in contention for this list. I also won't be factoring any of these PlayStation 4 games here that have a PlayStation 4 to PlayStation 5 upgrade like Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time or Watch Dogs Legion. This video is very specifically about PlayStation 5 games. So this little white stripe on the case here is mandatory when being considered to be added onto this list.
The other big thing to keep in mind is that I don't necessarily have all of the time in the world to have played all of these games in full. Some of them I've completed 100% and have the Platinum Trophy for, while others I've barely scratched the surface of. So, for this video, I gave myself a rule. I had to play each game for at least 3 hours prior to making this video, that way I could have at least some idea of what the game was all about without relying too much on my memories of it. In some cases, I went back and replayed them for another 3 hours or more, simply because it's been months or so since I last touched some of them, depriving them of that intimate relationship of being inserted into that hot slot.
And with that out of the way, I physically own 25 games as of the release of this video. So starting with number 25 and making our way to number 1, here are all of my physical PlayStation 5 games ranked from worst to best.
Ballin' Wonderworld is easily the worst game that I own for the PlayStation 5, but the worst part about it is that I can tell it wasn't intended as such. Some of the creature and costume designs are kind of neat, the world is vibrant and occasionally interesting, and the completely random dance sequences that end some levels are unintentionally hilarious. The problem here is literally everything else. The gameplay is boring and basic, the need to swap characters is cumbersome, especially when you need to go back and forth to get costumes because you can only carry 3 at a time for some reason, and any charm this game has quickly leaves the second you realize that these weird ballin' minigames are all the same and there's no joy or passion here whatsoever. Everything from the overabundance of collectibles to the tedious and minuscule open world feels either boring or uninspired, which was weird since this is made by Square Enix and not Ubisoft.
Oh! I'm just goofing. New boot goofing.
To put it simply, I own a copy of Ballin' Wonderworld simply because when I bought it, it was less than $10. And I thought I could have been one of those people who made a video titled something like, I got the platinum in Ballin' Wonderworld and here's why you shouldn't. But I quickly gave up on those plans after first trying the game. And even just meeting my own must-play for 3 hours requirement to get footage for this video made me almost want to cancel this video entirely. To put it simply, I have reached my threshold of interest in talking about this game. I might still try and platinum Ballin' Wonderworld at some point in the future, but only if I feel like being particularly mean to myself. But for now, let's focus on the video at hand, and instead move on towards what will hopefully be greener pastures.
It's tough to be a god.
Okay, so maybe greener pastures might have been a bit much to ask for. This is more like beige. Godfall was one of those games that I was never really interested in during early showings, and so I just added it to a wishlist on Amazon and kind of forgot about it. The only reason I own this game physically is because it was gifted to me for Christmas. I never even opened my physical copy of the game until I was starting to make this video, and now that I've actually played it for a few hours, yeah, it's kind of just boring. The combat can be stylish and flashy, but ultimately begins to feel stale after only a few encounters. The loot system is welcome, but rarely goes beyond choose the item that has the better stats. And the story is either non-existent or is just so boring that I can't even remember what it's about, and I just played the game like 10 minutes ago. Godfall is a largely soulless experience, which is a shame because if the combat were a bit more like Dark Souls, it might be more interesting. Instead, you're stuck playing as a bland protagonist who, according to Wikipedia, is like looking for revenge or something against their brother, fighting enemies that are so weak you might as well be a linebacker punching out toddlers, and it made me want to be a god even less than I already do. I can barely handle my own life. I'm not about to try and run the rest of the world.
Too many dungeons and all that!
Dungeons & Dragons as a tabletop game is about finding creative solutions to problems, cooperating with others, slaying hordes of monsters, and pissing off your DM. The video game Dark Alliance, meanwhile, limits you to specific characters from the D&D mythos, fighting for loot with other players, repeatedly hitting enemies with what feels like an arsenal of Nerf weapons, and just pissing off anyone who plays it. What stings the most about this experience, I think, is just how much love went into its production. R.A. Salvatore was a producer on the project from its very inception. The game features some of his more well-known characters from the books, and the overall concept does sound like a great time. But playing the game, that's a whole other story. Combat is stiff and rigid, your character turns slower than a semi-truck, and your attacks are dependent upon which direction your body is currently aimed rather than the camera. Enemies soak up damage like they're sponges being hit with water guns, and the whole experience feels like it wants to be a classic PlayStation 2 hack and slash experience with thrown on online elements without really understanding what made those original hack and slash games great. The only reason I even keep this game is because I have the steelbook for it, but I might even just turn the disc into GameStop for the $5 they'll give me, which I will point out is only $5 less than what I actually paid for it initially. Plus, whoever designed this steelbook case designed it wrong. They put the spine on the case in improperly, so basically you have to flip it in order for it to fit with the rest of the games. They basically just didn't put it in right. Why am I like this? Maybe if I had a few friends to play with, this could be fun, but if I'm getting a couple friends to play D&D, we're just gonna play D&D. At least then I can feel like I've accomplished something.
I'd like to dramatically gesture to this giant death-defying skateboard ramp behind me.
I don't usually get into extreme sports titles, and you could argue that I didn't really get into Riders Republic either, since I basically stopped playing it about a week or two after picking it up. But it was still a surprisingly fun open-ended experience in that short amount of time. Even just revisiting it for this video, I was having fun for a bit, but I think this is a game that's best played in small bursts. Riders Republic is a sort of spiritual successor to Steep, a game all about going downhill with a variety of extreme sports equipment, but instead of focusing solely on winter sports related stuff like skiing, snowboards, or snowmobiles, this game brings along bikes, wingsuits, and full-blown jetpacks into the mix. It's a fine enough game when it's not trying too hard to be hip and trendy, but I think what helps this one is two things: the variety of activities you can partake in, both in the open world and in races, as well as the generally silly atmosphere that permeates the game. There's honestly not much else I can say about it that isn't obvious given the box art. You either spend your time going from race to race using the appropriate mode of extreme transportation to do so, or you're exploring the immersive open world, finding landmarks, and not crashing into other people, which is kind of a shame. Overall, it's a game that I rarely have a desire to play anymore, but when I do get that itch, it's nice to know I have it. And being able to do extreme sports in nothing more than a flannel and some short shorts oddly speaks to me.
Where's the lamb sauce?
Come on, man.
Chaotic, cooperative games like Overcooked are best played on the couch with friends, but I don't have many friends, and the only other person on my couch is my dog, so I basically just did the best I could here. In Overcooked All You Can Eat, you're given access to all of the content released for both Overcooked and Overcooked 2, where the basic premise is the same between both major games. Something is attacking, whether it be an eldritch spaghetti monster or the unbred, and it's up to the chefs to learn new recipes to fight them. If only other world-ending events could be solved with snacks, like climate change or poverty.
Help me, I'm poor.
Well, it sounds to me like you just need a Snickers bar. Poverty solved. Overcooked is fine, but it's almost certainly made to play with friends, and I don't have many of those. In single player, you swap between two characters and do everything yourself, which can add a little bit of fun strategy to it, but is oftentimes more infuriating than it is fun. I hope that I can experience this one with friends soon, but for now, it'll just languish near the bottom of my I want to play this game list.
Your soul is mine.
I won't lie, Even I was a bit surprised to see this game down as low as it is, but I also never really feel like playing it and would rather play other games, so there you are. Demon's Souls is the Soulsborne game that started it all, giving players the hardcore, brutal experience that they had apparently been craving since Crash Bandy Boy had been on hiatus. This remaster from Bluepoint capitalized on just about every aspect of the original, nailing the dark atmosphere, intense combat, maze-like design of the world, and more. I'm just not a fan of Soulsborne games, personally. Don't get me wrong, the game is wonderfully made. The atmosphere is perfectly dark and gothic, the enemies are appropriately challenging, the world feels desolate and grim, and everything about it makes me want to play more, except for the gameplay itself. I'm not personally a huge fan of when games levy countless limitations onto you that keep me from playing the game, and that's kinda what a large part of what Demon's Souls is to me. Unless you're trying to speedrun it, in which case that's a whole other can of worms that I don't have time to get into here. I picked this one up hoping that the improved hardware might help me better enjoy the experience, but I found that outside of Bloodborne and on occasion Sekiro, I rarely find myself actually having fun with these games, and Demon's Souls is no exception. A fantastically built game, I will happily admit, but one that just really isn't for me. Though if they were to throw a trench coat on your guy and hand them a blunderbuss, I'd be ready to go.
Waka 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 waka. Let's get down to business.
If people weren't mad about Demon's Souls' placement on the list before, I sure as hell bet they are now. Pac-Man World Repack is a remake of the PlayStation 1 game Pac-Man World, a game I never played when it was originally released on the PlayStation 1 because I was 7 and my parents didn't get it for me. But playing through it now, with the many improvements that the game supposedly brought with it on improved hardware, it's alright. The game plays like a standard platforming title for the era, focusing on Pac-Man jumping his way through levels, collecting fruit, and defeating enemies, the majority of which are ghosts or ghoulies of some kind. Overall, it's a harmless little experience that at times feels like they shoved Pac-Man into it to try and bank on the success of the series, but it's still just kinda fine. Some of the level design can occasionally be annoying with blind jumps or annoying enemy placement, but otherwise it's just a serviceable and mercifully short experience. Unless you're going for platinum completion, but I'll get into that in a few more months. In the end, Pac-Man World Repack ranks just slightly higher than Demon's Souls for the simple fact that it is much more easily playable, at least for me. I think Demon's Souls overall is a much better designed and made game, but this is a list about the games I would rather play, and since I so rarely want to play either, I'll go with the one that's more easily approachable, even if I think it's a worse game than Demon's Souls, but at least I don't have to worry about watching Pac-Man being disemboweled when I play this. Borderlands is one of those franchises I have fond memories of, but after my first time playing through Borderlands 2 and Tales from the Borderlands, it's been hard for me to find that same kind of passion with the series. The pre-sequel was just alright, and Borderlands 3 rarely keeps my attention for very long, even when playing with a group of friends. So when Tiny Tina's Wonderlands was announced, I was genuinely excited. A fresh take on the formula featuring one of my favorite characters in a starring role, and new tweaks to make that tired old formula feel fresh while taking inspiration from arguably the best DLC from Borderlands 2? Sign me up! But then I played the game, and found myself feeling a little let down. Sure, the game innovates on the formula in a number of ways, but it also feels like a lot of the same old Borderlands that's been so dull as of late, even if I have more fun with this than I did Borderlands 3. Magic is a lot of fun to mess around with, and the variety to the spells is kinda cool, but it ultimately just feels like another category of gun or special ability that you can find rather than a whole other mechanic. I think what works best for this one is the focus on the D&D elements it's clearly lampooning, but it feels like too safe a bet at the same time when almost every enemy you fight is just a skeleton, and the D&D stuff barely goes beyond Tina changing her mind about something for comedic effect or to make it harder. It might be because I haven't played more than a few hours into the game that I feel this way, but if I play a few hours into a game and it hasn't really hooked me yet, I'm not likely gonna keep playing. Overall, it's still fun, but there are other games that I would rather play that parody or lampoon Dungeons and Dragons. Just not, you know, the actual D&D game. Deathloop is a game with fantastic art direction, an intriguing premise, incredible gameplay, and a pedigree behind it that had me initially excited, but ultimately feels a bit lacking in just about every respect. That's not to say that the game isn't fun though. A lot of the fun I have with this game is going into a fight with a few individuals I've fought like 10 times already, trying out a new ability I may have unlocked or a new gun I picked up before figuring out how it can best help me in my quest. Cole and Juliana have a fun dynamic that works well to tell the story, and a lot of the environments offer that same feeling of freedom that Dishonored had, where it truly feels like you're able to tackle problems in almost any way you desire. But it's that almost anyway comment that sinks this one a bit for me. While initial reveals of the game showcase an exploration-focused narrative that has players finding multiple routes towards an end goal of taking out 8 individuals, the actual gameplay boils down to rote memorization and taking very specific pathways, making this otherwise large and expansive game feel small and limited. In the end, Deathloop is an occasionally transcendent, otherwise alright Groundhog Day style story with some fun gameplay, an even more fun aesthetic, and a pair of leads that help elevate this one above some other titles on this list by those merits alone. I just wish it pushed that little bit further to be something truly fantastic. Easily the most content-packed LEGO game to date, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga features 9 movies worth of content with over 300 characters, multiple planets, plenty of in-jokes, and about 17 metric tons of LEGO bricks. The game is so packed with content that there's rarely nothing to do within the game. Each planet you visit has dozens of tasks to complete, be that doing a mission for a gold brick or unlocking a new character, and the individual story missions themselves all have plenty of content packed into them. But this much content can be a bit of a burden on players at the same time. I myself have been playing LEGO games for years, and since I'm the kind of person who has to complete games like this, it becomes harder for me to get invested when so much more of the game is relegated to side content and unlockables with each new entry. Where once I might have had to unlock somewhere in the ballpark of like 90 characters, there's now 300 of them. And that's just the individual minifigs that you have to unlock.
No more! Where the fuck are your parents?
With as much content as there is here, it's almost overwhelming, which is probably part of why it's taking me so long to get through it all. Granted, this game justifies its immense scope with 9 individual movies and a whole expanded universe of content to pull from, so it gets a lot of points for that fact alone. The game is fun and a lot of the improvements to the formula are welcome, but at the end of the day, it's still a LEGO title at its midichlorian riddled core, one that I feel like I enjoy more than some others, but not enough to warrant a higher ranking on this list. Nickelodeon! I just made a video talking about this game already, having spent about 3 hours of my time playing the game before making that one, so I'll be quick here. Nickelodeon Kart Racers 3 Slime Speedway is basically everything that title implies it is. A kart racing game starring Nickelodeon characters where slime is on the racetracks. With 40 racers, 36 tracks, and literal thousands of customization combinations, the game will keep dedicated players playing for hours upon hours, while still acting as a serviceable, if mildly flawed, product. Kind of like Nickelodeon itself, really. My issues mostly stem from small things, like what I see as odd choices for the playable roster of racers, but the one that really sticks out to me is the speeds the AI racers are able to reach at higher difficulties, combined with some frankly stupid AI issues. During a race, an AI racer might suddenly just be twice as fast as you for a moment, but then the next you're coming around a corner and you see them bumping repeatedly into the wall, making for a mildly infuriating experience overall when they somehow end up passing you in the very end of the race anyways. In general, Nickelodeon Kart Racers 3 is a serviceable racing experience, but I would still probably choose to play Crash Team Racing or Mario Kart over this one. Good enough for what it is, but there are certainly better experiences. Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. A beautifully realized vision of a haunted Shibuya, Ghostwire Tokyo has mildly clunky feeling controls, a fantastically unique premise, enough horror elements to keep my butt properly clenched the whole time I'm playing, and a lot of potential just based on my initial 3 hours of playing the game for this video. The main premise is of a spirit named KK inhabiting the recently deceased Akito, using him as a vessel to fight yokai and save the souls of Shibuya from a mysterious masked individual. Akito and KK travel through Shibuya attempting to find Akito's sister, who was kidnapped by this masked individual, battling various yokai and saving the souls of various people along the way. It's kind of implied that KK and the masked guy know each other, which I choose to take that as a lover's quarrel that ended in KK's death, but that could just be the shipper in me talking. I will say that early on at least, the game loads a lot of tutorials and cutscenes in an effort to showcase everything the world has to offer. But with a lore-rich game like this, I can kinda understand why. If they simply dropped you into the world, told you your hands were glowing with Tron technology and said, "Ghosts are attacking, have fun, loser," then it might throw a lot of people off. Front-loading all of the tutorials and such means that you can have more fun exploring later, and we'll see if that ends up being true in the end. All in all, Ghostwire Tokyo is a fun experience, even if there's a bit of a learning curve just understanding what's happening half the time. In some ways, it feels like an anime brought into a facsimile of real life. In others, it feels like your typical Bethesda title with some clunk and funk that just needs to be accepted to enjoy, but overall feels like a passion project initially spearheaded by one of gaming's most adorable devs. Resogun is one of my personal favorite games for the PlayStation 4, and that's something I bring up so much it's become a detriment to my polyamorous social life.
They must have been more of a fan of Knack.
When I first saw that Housemarque would be making a third-person shooter, I was admittedly a little disappointed. I personally would have liked to see a more arcadey shoot-'em-up title like Resogun, and I was genuinely surprised to find out that that's kind of what we got with Returnal. Returnal is a lot like Deathloop, in that it has a time looping mechanic as part of its gameplay and story, but I personally feel that the game works better with it than Deathloop did for one simple reason. The fact that the game is a roguelike helps each run through the labyrinthian maze of Atropos feel unique while progressing the story, while Deathloops merely allows you to perfect singular runs in the same environments over and over and over. You still get weird bits of story thrown in for good measure, but otherwise you play through a massive labyrinth full of monsters that probably smell like moldy onions who shoot Ikaruga bullets at you constantly. Of the two time loop games I physically own for PlayStation 5, Returnal is easily the one that I would rather play, simply because I don't have to memorize a million different routes and just have to remember what part of the confusing story I'm in whenever I jump back into it. If I were to play through most, if not all of Deathloop continuously, I might feel differently, but I like skipping between games and playing multiples at once, so that kind of structure works better with something like Returnal. Now, if I could just remember why the heck this random ass house is here, then maybe I can advance the story a bit more.
The gang's all here.
Some people will probably scoff at this game being as high up on the list as it is, but I personally had fun with the newest Saints Row right up until I went for completion. I personally fell in love with the Saints Row franchise thanks to Saints Row 4, and while this new game leans a bit more towards the serious and grounded approach with a touch of silly that Saints Row III employed, it's still injected with decent humor and a few unique open world gimmicks. I personally enjoyed the dynamic that the main cast shared. And while I might have missed the antics of characters like Johnny Gat or Kinsey Kensington, everyone in this new crew brings their own unique flair to this experience. However, the bugs for this one were a bit inexcusable at times, causing me more than once to lose progress or have to restart missions because of something completely out of my control. It doesn't help that the majority of the side content and even some of the main mission stuff involves either a shootout or driving from point A to B, which really makes this one drag for a while. Keep in mind, that's more me talking about trying to complete the game. The actual story missions and a few side missions were a lot of fun, but there was a lot of content that felt tedious after all that was done, and many of the missions still fell into one of those two camps. Though I will give the game credit, one of the side missions did try to make everything go faster by literally nuking itself for me. Overall, I enjoy how this new Saints Row plays, even if mechanics like vehicle drifting took a while to get used to. But the game feels a bit too generic at times to really feel like a Saints Row game to me. Then again, my idea of what makes a Saints game is heavily skewed in Saints Row 4's favor, so maybe I'm not the best authority on the subject. The Tony Hawk games are some of the most approachable skateboarding games on the market, blending over-the-top tricks and fluid inputs and often juvenile humor. It all started back in the PlayStation 1 days with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, and this remake of those two games by Vicarious Visions is a wonderful recreation, but these just aren't my Tony Hawk games. I personally didn't get into the franchise until Pro Skater 4, and by that point, the series had transitioned from silly, over-the-top nonsense within the span of about 2 minutes, and instead became a free-roaming affair full of places to skate and people to annoy, still packed with that silly, over-the-top nonsense. The 2-minute structure of the original games feels massively restricting to me, but it can also be a lot of fun to try and get as much stuff in a level during a first run-through. I do wish there was an option to toggle this on and off in the remake, allowing me to better explore the maps, finding trick paths, and fall on my face multiple times over without having to worry about a time crunch. But I'll still take some good old-fashioned arcade skating either way. The series stuck around for as long as it has for a reason, and that's thanks in large part to its easy to pick up and play mechanics, excellent controls, and just a general fun factor. And it's one of those series that I usually enjoy playing. But when I'm looking for some good old-fashioned arcade fun, this one is an excellent celebration of an equally excellent series beginnings, even if I personally would have preferred one of the newer entries by comparison. I mean, who wouldn't want to see this in HD?
Mommy, sorry. Mommy, sorry. Mommy, sorry.
Resident Evil Village is a fantastic game with great characters, scenarios, and set-piece moments, but I will admit that most of my adulation for the game comes from Alcina Dimitrescu and her vampiric daughters. Following in the footsteps of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, with a more grounded approach to gameplay, Village decided to just go balls to the wall weird with its characters, and it just kinda worked out. Overall, I enjoyed the game, but I almost always think back to that castle, its residents, and the main lady of the house, so my appreciation of the game is a bit skewed in favor of the game's opening and castle beyond that. Granted, that could be because the game's marketing focused so much on Lady Dimitrescu and her dynamic digits, but it's more than just that for me. Certain segments of the game feel slower than others, and while slow gameplay inside a Resident Evil title isn't necessarily a bad thing, it feels like they made a few miniature games and stuffed them into one, rather than make something singular like the horrors of Resident Evil 7. The game features probably some of the best boss fights in the series in a while, and while I personally would prefer less action and more horror in my Resident Evil games, I felt like Village almost nailed the balancing act needed to make a fantastic product. All in all, Village is a great time if you're a fan of horror games. The game looks absolutely stunning most of the time, the characters are all fun and unique, and if nothing else, it gave the world tall mommy milkers, so that's an automatic win in my book. And hey, with the game receiving a VR release or update or whatever you want to call it for the PlayStation VR 2, it's only a matter of time before my dream of resting my head on those heavenly pillows can sort of come true.
Imagination.
This placement is just Demon Souls to Pac-Man all over again. Sackboy: A Big Adventure is the first game in the LittleBigPlanet series to transition to 3D, foregoing the usual side-scrolling 2D level structure and bringing the vibrantly stylized worlds of your local Joann Fabrics to life in a whole new way. While some series have a hard time transitioning from 2D to 3D or vice versa, I personally feel that this one managed to change rather effectively, making for an overall fun experience. However, the game is not without at least a few flaws. For one thing, I feel like Sackboy's general run speed is kinda slow, making some levels feel like they just drag on for how much longer they need to be. Then there's the lack of cross-content from previous games, because I used to love running around as a sack person with Clank's head and Daxter's body, but now I can't do that. But above all else, the thing that stings the most for me is the lack of the creativity tools. I'm one of those few people who actually liked going in and building levels in the older games, and the prospect of being able to make fully 3D levels instead of the faux 2.5D levels that you could kind of achieve with LittleBigPlanet 3 would have been awesome. But nope. As I said, these are just minor gripes for an otherwise fantastic little game. I do wish the creativity tools were a thing for the sake of consistency throughout the series, and because I have ideas that cannot be fulfilled, but I guess cuts must be made to accommodate putting a Bruno Mars song into the game, so who am I to judge? I've talked about the first to destroy all humans a couple times on this channel, since it's one of the only 3 games that I have a platinum for across 2 different versions of the game, those being the remake and the PS2 to PS4 re-release. But I never really sat down to talk about Destroy All Humans 2 ever, and that's because up until this remake, I never played it. This time around, Crypto and Pox are facing off against the KGB, who have literally blasted them out of the sky and are taking the fight to them. In his quest to thwart the Red Menace, Crypto works with a former Soviet spy, a British spy, some hippies who are probably spies at this point, and other individuals that may or may not be spies, to fight his way through humanity to prove once again that he's the dominant life form. All in all, this game makes me want to play the original Destroy All Humans 2, since it manages to improve on basically everything in a similar fashion that the first game's remake did, and I'm kinda curious to see exactly how much of an improvement it is. Things look nicer, the new content is lovely, and from what I can tell, it's basically more of the game I already enjoyed. However, I personally think that the remake leaned a little too heavily into its new visuals, making all of the humans look more like caricatures or stereotypes rather than uniquely designed characters, but with how lovely the rest of the game is, this is just gonna get a pass from me. In general, the game is just fun to play since it builds off of what came before, and even just running around collecting different types of humans to blend them up so my boots look shinier has entertained me endlessly.
What a bunch of a-holes.
I've been vocal about my initial skepticism of this game before it was released, thanks in large part to them only showing off 1 or 2 major bits of the game, but I genuinely had a blast playing through all of Square Enix and Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Instead of dipping its toes too snugly into the MCU and banking on the success of the film franchise, this game largely focuses on more comic-accurate versions of the characters, even if the roster of heroes borrows more favorably from the MCU. I mean, like, side characters like Mantis are here, and she has a design somewhat reminiscent of the films, but more so like of the comics. But also she has her ability to see throughout time and is easily the most adorable character in the whole game, so I'll give it a pass. Okay, maybe not the most adorable. As I played through the game and experienced the fairly well-written story, I thought it was a charming and investing dive into these characters and their struggles, and it quickly became one of my favorite games for this early generation. I do wish some of the choices you made had more of an impact on the story outside of taking a left path instead of a right to reach the same destination, but otherwise the game was a lot of fun to play through from start to finish, and I genuinely might want to do it again soon. Guardians of the Galaxy is a Marvel franchise I never thought would have public acclaim up until James Gunn's film, and while I wish they had made some more unique choices in terms of the roster or characterizations to help differentiate them further, it was still a lot of fun to play through.
It's not always about the money, Spider-Man. It's about the Mets, baby. Love the Mets.
Be greater. Be yourself.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wants that.
Okay, yes, the game is short. Yes, it just reuses a lot of assets and stuff from the PlayStation 4 Spider-Man game. And yes, the character model swap for Peter is a bit jarring. But Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales is just a fantastic game if you ask me, and one that anytime I need to go back into to get footage for, I'm more than happy to do so. Miles Morales takes place a few months after the events of the first game, with Miles newly minted as the Spider-Person and helping Peter to protect New York from the various threats they routinely face. But wouldn't you know it, as soon as Peter goes on a sort of work vacation is when two major factions rise up to try and take control of the city. Couple that with Miles' own struggles with adapting to his new spider life, and it's all you really need for a tried and true Spider-Man tale. What I personally love is that Miles isn't just another Peter, both in his characterization but also his moveset and abilities. Miles has his own powers, and they're given a chance to shine here, including both his Venom abilities and his invisibility, making every encounter feel fun and unique. Couple that with his swinging animations looking less rehearsed and practiced, and it's honestly the best way this game could have been presented. The only real issue I have with it is how short of a game it is, but if I want to just kill an afternoon with a good game, it's one of the better ones I have to turn to. It's a lot of fun to play, looks absolutely gorgeous as a launch title for the system, and just has me even more hyped for whatever Spider-Man 2 has in store coming out next year.
But now we come to that all-important part of any ranking video, the one where all of these choices have ultimately led up to, and where most of the vitriol and hatred will potentially be slung in my direction. That's right, folks, we're finally reached the top 5 games of this list. Each of these games are ones that I would genuinely sit down and play more of whenever I want to decompress or whatever. And some of these are my favorite games on the system, not just because I own them physically. And for number 5, I was actually a little surprised to see it ranked this high, let alone in the number 5 spot.
Together we'll exterminate, assassinate!
No!
The finer points can wait.
Normally, I don't get into a game that is methodical and tactical like IO Interactive's more recent Hitman series. I even tried getting into the previous 2 entries of this rebooted series of games, but couldn't make it more than a few missions in before I was just getting bored. And yet somehow, either because I was watching Achievement Hunter blunder their way through the main 6 missions of the game, or I just finally decided to give it a fair shake, something clicked in my head with this series, and I finished the main story of Hitman 3 in a single sitting. The premise of Hitman 3 is that you're on the run from the organization you used to work for in the first 2 games, and you're slowly attempting to dismantle the power structures that keep the organization running. In practice, however, you can throw a banana at some guy's head, take his place as a guard, get caught, knock out whoever finds you, take their clothes, and eventually kill the target you're supposed to keep alive and have to do it all over again. It's the right kind of methodical and whimsical that I can vibe behind, and with the games actively encouraging multiple playthroughs of levels to try new and unique ways of taking out targets, it's great fun for hours on end. My personal favorite is still knocking an old woman into her fake grave while her bodyguard has his back turned, and when he asks where she went, you can just say she went back inside and that's it. Murder complete, enjoy your countryside bike ride, sir. Overall, the sandbox nature of the world means I can just have silly, goofy fun or become the ultimate silent assassin. And I can safely say that Hitman 3 is a highlight of the series for me. It's enough for me to want to go back and play through the first 2 games as well. And Hitman 3 does allow you to port in levels from those games into it, so soon enough, I'll be throwing magical tracking briefcases at jet skiers in no time.
On second thoughts, let's not go to Camelot. It is a silly place. Right.
Similar to Hitman, I only got into the idea of playing Chivalry thanks to watching others online doing silly and stupid things, and it quickly became one of my favorite games to just hop into and have fun with. Chivalry 2 is a semi-realistic fight between two warring factions of medieval knights, perpetually stuck in a conflict because one side wears red and one side wears blue, so the law of conflict deems them mortal enemies. Combat takes place across a few different battlegrounds with individual goals in each, like pushing a caravan of wagons or simply slaughtering more of your opponents than they slaughter you. The fact that I can't choose what map or game modes to play is kind of annoying, and sometimes team balance is a joke, but otherwise the game is a lot of fun to play. Each map is well constructed to allow for strategic plays, or you can just as easily run into the fray, swinging wildly for some truly chaotic fun. The consequences of who you're slashing willy-nilly be damned. Oh, that's what happens.
So yeah, Chivalry 2 is just a overall fun game to play. But for our final 3 games, it was genuinely hard for me to pick which one I preferred between the 3 of them. But a list like this can't win in a 3-way tie without feeling like some form of cop-out, so one must win over the others. Which one won out in the end?
Read it, boy.
God of War Ragnarok opens with the death of good boy Fenrir. 0 out of 10, everyone disliked that. Game of the year 2022. Following in the footsteps of the incredible 2018 God of War, Ragnarok sees Kratos, Atreus, and Mimir facing off against the Norse pantheon during Fimbulwinter, the precursor to the titular world-ending event. While Kratos wants to protect Atreus and stay out of the fight, Atreus wants to learn more about who he is and his place in everything as Loki, once again causing a bit of strife between the two of them. The brief glimpse of this game I've seen, thanks to about 4 hours of gameplay, showcases a lot of character depth for the both of them, and I can only imagine what's to come given the surprising level of emotion the first game employed. And speaking of the first game, this one follows in its footsteps perfectly, adapting the combat and world structure of that game to a T while introducing new mechanics to keep things a bit fresh. Kratos has access to both the Leviathan Axe and the Blaze of Chaos from the get-go, and while all of the armor collected in the first game is gone in your back-to-basic attacks, the game actually makes fun of it a bit in a surprisingly in-character fashion.
Hey, what happened to all the armor we made you already?
I used it.
Well, maybe try to make this one last longer.
I will not.
God of War Ragnarok is probably my favorite game to come out this year thus far, hands down.
But there are 2 other games on this list that I can still see myself picking up over this one.
The multiverse is a concept about which we know frighteningly little.
Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is, at the time of me making this video, my favorite exclusive game for the PlayStation 5. It's easily my second favorite game in the Ratchet and Clank franchise, right behind Deadlocked, one of the best games produced by Insomniac to date, and just overall an excellent game. I think the only reason it currently edges out God of War is the simple fact that, again, as of making this video, I'm still playing through God of War Ragnarok, whereas I've played through Rift Apart at least 3 times now. Rift Apart introduces fantastic new characters, innovative gameplay tweaks, and expansive worlds to explore, each of which feels like they bring something new to the universe of Ratchet and Clank while still falling into familiar tropes. Rivet and Kit are both welcome additions to this expanded universe, as are the doppelganger versions of other characters like Skid McMarx or Captain Quark, and I genuinely hope that Insomniac doesn't just drop them for the next title like they love to do with other one-off characters like Talwyn or Angela Cross. But one of the best parts of the game are the improvements to combat, both in terms of refining the formula the franchise has been using for close to 20 years, but also in what the game adds. The haptic feedback of the DualSense controller lets guns have half pulls for their triggers, and many of them having unique effects like charging up a shot or loading a single barrel versus a double barrel blast are unique for combat. Combine that with the new wave dash ability and rift tether, and you have some of the most fun to mess around with and explore combat experiences in the series. In general, the game is a blast to play through, and I genuinely almost ended up just completing the game again while trying to get footage for it. One of the only real faults I have with it is the lack of a more expansive arena mode, but that could just be because Deadlocked is one giant arena and it's my favorite game in the series, so when are we going to get Deadlocked 2, Insomniac?
Regardless of that, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is absolutely one of, if not the best exclusive game on the PlayStation 5, and yet, similar to how it beat out God of War Ragnarok, there is one other game that barely manages to beat it out for the top spot.
It's time for the moment you've been waiting for.
Hades is one of the few games I would unironically call a 10 out of 10 game. Everything from the presentation, voice acting, music, controls, fighting style, and more is just perfect in my mind. And it's certainly one of the best games I own on the PlayStation 5. I originally picked this one up for Switch, and after having some fun with it there, I decided I had to buy it and platinum it, a task that was admittedly challenging, but absolutely rewarding. The combat is intuitive and adaptive, the story is wonderfully told, the interactions between characters are lovely, and the game is just full of love and attention to detail from a development team passionate about making the best game they can to the point where it's hard not to like it. The game even lets you pet one of Cerberus's heads just because you can, which helps make being stabbed through the heart only to wake up in a pool of blood less of a pain simply because I get to pet this good boy, even if only one of his heads like Scritch's. Literally my only complaint with the game at this point is that I can't also pet/hug Boldy the same way I can Cerberus, but that's a very minor nitpick if anything. But I mean, come on, look at him. Who wouldn't want to snuggle hug that lovable face?
In terms of our discussion today, Hades is the game that I would easily drop anything else on this list to play more of. Games like Hitman 3 are great for their replayability. Chivalry 2 has fun combat mechanics. God of War Ragnarok has a fantastic story, and Rift Apart is all of that and more, but Hades does it all so much better in my mind for the sheer fact that it is a roguelike experience, a genre that I personally enjoy. There's only so many times I can play through Rift Apart because of its more limited structure, and that is really the main reason why Hades barely edges it out for the top spot on this list. There's honestly a ton that I want to talk about with Hades, but I plan on making one big video talking about it all sometime next year, so keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, that's the list. Of all of the games that I own for the PlayStation 5 physically, there's really only one game that I would say I genuinely just don't enjoy. And I mainly have it because I have a habit of spending money on stupid things that no amount of therapy can fix. For the rest, I can usually see the inherent good in each of them, and while I certainly enjoy some over others, I'm glad to consider them part of my collection. There are plenty of other games I wish I had, I might already own digitally but would still like a physical copy of, or that I just want for my collection even if I never touch it unless I do something like this again. And I do intend to get some of them sometime soon, but right now I'm poor or they aren't out yet, so that's kind of hard to do. I like basically everything that I have to play, but as I said at the top of this video, I wanted to start some fights today, including with myself, I guess. So I undoubtedly ranked something higher or lower than you would, and I'm actually curious to see what you would think. Let me know down in the comments below, follow me on the socials and whatnot that you see on screen, and I will see all of you in the next video. Thank you again for watching, and take care.